Morning in the countryside of Ukraine often begins quietly. Fields stretch across the land in long rows. Trees stand between narrow farm roads. And during harvest season, orchards fill the air with the soft scent of fruit and damp soil. But on this particular morning, the calm of the fields was interrupted. Across the distance, the first sound arrived as a low echo rolling over the farmland. It was not thunder. It was not a passing storm. It was artillery. The farmers working near the orchard heard it almost immediately. At first, the sound was distant, carried faintly across the hills. But anyone who had lived through the long months of fighting in Ukraine understood the difference between distant noise and approaching danger. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath. A few seconds passed. Then another distant boom. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Russian shelling had begun. For the farmers standing near the orchard, the moment carried a difficult decision. The trees stretched in careful rows across the land. Apple branches moved lightly in the morning wind. Between them, narrow paths ran toward the edge of the fields. This land had been worked for years. Families had planted these trees. They had watched them grow season after season, and now the sound of artillery echoed above them. One farmer set down the crate he had been carrying. Another turned slowly toward the direction of the sound. No one spoke at first. Moments like this had become familiar across Ukraine's countryside. When artillery began in the distance, people often had only seconds to decide what came next: leave or stay. The orchard stood silent. A small tractor remained parked near the dirt path that cut between the trees. Baskets of fruit sat beside wooden crates that had not yet been moved toward the storage shed. Life had been moving forward only minutes earlier. Then the next shell landed somewhere beyond the hills. The sound rolled across the farmland again. Birds lifted suddenly from the tops of the trees. The farmers watched the horizon carefully. One of them spoke quietly. "We've heard this before." The sentence carried no panic, only recognition. Across Ukraine, thousands of farms had continued working despite the war moving across nearby regions. Fields still needed tending. Crops still needed harvesting. The land did not pause simply because the world had changed, but artillery changed the rhythm of the day. Another echo rolled across the fields. Closer now. The farmers looked toward the orchard again. Rows of trees moved gently in the wind. The soil beneath them showed the careful work of weeks of preparation. And beyond those trees, the land stretched toward small villages and narrow country roads. Those villages depended on the fields, the orchards, the farms. If the land was abandoned, the work of entire seasons would disappear. One of the farmers stepped forward slowly. He looked again toward the direction of the shelling, then back toward the orchard. And then he spoke again, quietly but firmly. "We stay with the fields." The others nodded. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple agreement, because for many people living across rural Ukraine, the land was not just work. It was memory, it was history, it was family. Another distant explosion rolled across the hills, but the farmers remained where they stood. One lifted a crate from the ground again, another walked back toward the tractor. The orchard waited in long rows beneath the pale morning sky. Work resumed slowly between the trees, not because the danger had disappeared, but because the fields still needed tending. And across the countryside of Ukraine, even as artillery echoed in the distance, people continued protecting the land that had sustained them for generations. A few minutes later, another shell struck somewhere beyond the orchard. The sound echoed sharply across the farmland, but the farmers remained among the trees. One of them paused briefly and looked across the rows of branches. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "This land remembers us." The wind moved gently through the orchard. The trees swayed softly beneath the growing light of morning, and the work continued. The morning continued slowly across the orchard. The first echoes of artillery had passed, but the tension in the air remained. Every few minutes, the distant rumble rolled again across the hills, reminding everyone in the fields that the front line was not as far away as it once had been. The farmers moved carefully between the rows of trees. Crates were lifted again. Baskets were carried along narrow dirt paths. The quiet rhythm of work returned, though now every movement carried a different awareness. The orchard stretched farther than it first appeared. Row after row of trees lined the land, their branches bending slightly under the weight of fruit. From a distance, it looked peaceful, almost unchanged from seasons before the war. but anyone standing inside those rows could hear the difference. Artillery in the distance, the occasional tremor of ground beneath their boots, and the long silence that followed each explosion. One of the farmers walked toward the edge of the orchard where the land opened into wide farmland. From there, the horizon could be seen more clearly. Low hills stood in the distance, and beyond them, somewhere lay the direction from which the shelling had begun earlier that morning. He stood there quietly for a moment, not watching the sky, not searching for aircraft, simply listening. A long pause passed, then he turned back toward the orchard again. The others were still working. A tractor engine started slowly near the shed. Wooden crates were stacked carefully beside the dirt road that connected the orchard to the nearby village. Life was continuing in small, steady motions. Another distant boom echoed across the fields. This one sounded slightly farther away than the earlier ones. The farmer nodded quietly to himself. Then he walked back into the rows of trees. Across Ukraine's countryside, scenes like this had become strangely familiar. The land had always demanded patience. Farming had never been easy, even in peaceful times. Weather could change suddenly. Harvest seasons could bring unexpected challenges, but war introduced a new kind of uncertainty. Still, the land itself remained. The trees continued to grow, the soil continued to produce fruit, and the people who had cared for that soil for generations continued returning to it each morning. One farmer paused beside a row of trees and looked across the orchard again. Sunlight had begun spreading across the branches now. The early gray of morning had lifted slightly, revealing the soft colors of the fields around them. In the distance, the rooftops of the village appeared between lines of trees. Smoke from a chimney rose slowly into the sky. Someone in the village had begun preparing breakfast. The quiet signs of daily life continued. Another farmer lifted a basket and walked toward the tractor. He stopped for a moment beside the vehicle and wiped dust from his hands. The sound of artillery had faded slightly now. Only faint echoes reached the orchard. Still, no one assumed the shelling had ended. Everyone understood how quickly the front could change. One of the older farmers walked slowly along the row of trees nearest the road. His steps were measured, careful. He had spent decades working this land, long before the war, long before artillery had become part of the background of daily life. He stopped beside a tree and looked at its branches. The fruit hanging there showed the careful growth of the entire season, weeks of watering, pruning, watching the weather. He touched one of the branches gently. Then he looked across the orchard toward the others. They continued moving between the rows. Work had fully resumed now. Crates were filling. The tractor engine hummed quietly. From a distance, it looked almost like any other harvest morning. The older farmer spoke softly. "Fields don't wait." The words were simple, but everyone understood them. The land followed its own calendar. War could disrupt roads, towns, and cities, but crops still grew according to the seasons. Harvest still came when the fruit was ready. Another farmer nodded. He lifted another crate and placed it beside the others. The orchard seemed calmer now. Birds returned to the tops of the trees. The wind moved lightly through the branches again. Even the distant artillery had grown quieter, still present, but farther away. One of the younger farmers looked toward the horizon once more. He listened carefully. Then he turned back toward the others. For now, the orchard remained safe enough to continue working. And so the harvest continued. Not because the danger had vanished, but because the land had not changed. Rows of trees stretched across the soil, and people who had spent their lives caring for that land remained among them. The older farmer looked across the fields once more. Then he said quietly, "We protect what grows here." The sentence carried no anger, no dramatic tone, just a calm statement of responsibility. Around him, the work continued steadily. Morning light spread farther across the orchard. The rows of trees stood quietly beneath the sky, and despite the distant echoes of war, the farmers of Ukraine continued guarding the land that had fed their families for generations. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, the orchard had changed again. The distant shelling that had broken the quiet of the morning had gradually faded into something farther away. The echoes still appeared from time to time across the hills, but the rhythm had slowed, and the fields around the orchard had returned to a quieter sound. Wind through branches, footsteps along the dirt path, the low hum of the tractor moving slowly between rows of trees. The farmers continued their work with steady patience. Crates that had been empty in the early morning were now filled and stacked near the small wooden shed at the edge of the orchard. Baskets of fruit lined the back of the tractor trailer. The harvest was moving forward. No one had spoken much during the day. The kind of focus that comes with long work in the fields had settled across the orchard. Each person moved with the familiarity of years spent working the same soil. Hands reached for branches. Fruit was placed carefully into baskets. Crates were lifted and carried toward the storage area. Above them, the sky slowly shifted from the bright white of midday into the softer gold of late afternoon. The orchard looked almost peaceful again. From a distance, anyone watching the fields might not even notice that the war had passed so close that morning. But the farmers remembered. Every distant echo that had rolled across the hills had reminded them that the front line of the war had drawn near to the countryside once again. Still, the orchard remained standing. The rows of trees stretched exactly where they had been planted years earlier. The soil beneath them held the careful work of generations. One of the farmers paused near the edge of the orchard where the land opened toward the road. The road itself remained quiet, a narrow line of dirt and gravel that connected the farmland to the nearby village. He looked down that road for a moment. Nothing moved there, no vehicles, no dust rising from passing tires, only the long quiet of the countryside. He turned back toward the orchard again. The others continued loading the final crates onto the trailer. The work of the day was nearly finished. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the light across the fields turned warmer. Long shadows stretched between the rows of trees. The branches moved gently in the wind. The orchard had endured the day. Another farmer wiped his hands against his jacket and looked across the land. He had listened to the shelling in the morning just like the others. He had watched the horizon. He had waited to see if the danger would move closer. But the orchard still stood and the harvest had continued. He spoke quietly as the last crates were stacked. "The trees are still here." The sentence was simple, but everyone heard it. The older farmer nodded slowly. He had spent decades working these fields, through difficult seasons, through storms and droughts, and now through a war that had moved across much of the country, but the land had remained, the soil had remained, the orchard had remained, and the people who cared for it had remained with it. As the final crate was secured on the trailer, the tractor engine started again. The vehicle rolled slowly toward the dirt road leading back toward the village. Behind it, the rows of trees stretched across the field in long, quiet lines. Evening birds crossed the sky above them. The wind carried the smell of earth and leaves across the farmland. One farmer looked back across the orchard one last time before climbing onto the trailer. The sun now sat low on the horizon, casting golden light across the branches. He watched the rows of trees for a moment. Then he said softly, "The land stays." No one answered, but no one needed to, because the meaning was already clear, despite the echoes of artillery, despite the uncertainty of the war moving across the region. The orchard in Ukraine had remained, and the farmers who cared for those fields had stood beside it. The tractor moved slowly down the road toward the village. Behind it, the orchard stood quietly beneath the evening sky, and across the fields of Ukraine, the land continued to endure.